We're out exploring churches in Norfolk again, but today the churches we're visiting are in one of the most secretive parts of England. On Ordnance Survey maps it appears as a patch of white mist, like a ghost among the green forests, fields and winding Norfolk lanes. Roads that enter the zone become tracks and multiply, as if we were still in the years before the Second World War and the land was measured by walking across it rather than driving through it. Leaving the area, the tracks disappear or merge into busy modern roads. For a moment, they'd been lost in time. But the lanes must travel through this time warp alone, for this strange area of Breckland, which God knows is a curious enough landscape in itself, has been used by the British Army for the last 80 years as a battle training area. As this involves the firing of live ammunition, nobody lives in the zone, and the 6 former villages within the training area have been able to softly and silently vanish. The soft Norfolk clunch out of which many of the buildings were made has melted into the ground, leaving mounds of flint, chimney stacks, and the occasional cellar. Very little remains, with the singular exception of the churches. Our first stop on our journey through the churches of the training area is the former parish church of West Tofts. Now, it may look to you as though this is 2 churches joined together, which is almost exactly right, because in the early 1850s, the Sutton family of Linford Hall paid for a massive restoration here. Their architect was the famous Augustus Welby Pugin. All that remains of the medieval church is the 14th century West Tower. It's very similar to the one at Santon Downham, just over the border in Suffolk, even to the extent of having the same flushwork base course with the initials of the donors. But in the early 1850s, the old church was replaced by this impressive building to the east. And if you think this is grand, wait until you see inside. What the Sutton family got for their money was one of the most lavish restorations in the whole of East Anglia. Pugin designed a complete church, including all its furnishings, this screen above me, the reredos behind me, and stenciling on all the walls. But of course, the Suttons weren't just paying for a pretty church. This would be their final resting place, and their memorials are quite grand. The iron railings on the front of this one has the Sutton rebus, a barrel or tun with an S on it. It's a strange thought, but for the last 80 years or so, hardly anyone has seen them. Of the 6 villages in the training area, Buckenham Tofts was one of the smallest, but it had quite the grandest building, Buckenham Tofts Hall. The hall was demolished soon after the First World War, and all that survives of it is the stable block behind me. There was a church and churchyard near to the hall, but it was demolished in the 17th century, and gardens were laid out in the area around it. It's possible that the garden designer Capability Brown was involved. More recently, this part of the training area was used to film the television series Dad's Army. The smallest of the churches in the training area is Langford, a pretty little Norman church that once had a medieval tower, but by the time of the 1851 census of religious worship, the tower had gone. The rector of the time, John Raven, recorded that it had been lost to time or accident. The church was restored soon after, but there are still a number of survivals that show what was here before. Langford Church is a good example of a typical small East Anglian church, Norman in origin, with a nave and a chancel. You'll notice the beautiful round chancel arch behind me. Generally, everything is understated, except for one thing. In the early 18th century, this remarkably grand memorial to the Garrard family was installed in the chancel. There's three generations, grandfather, father, and grandson, and they're all wearing Roman togas, and of course it's completely pagan in its organisation. We've come right into the heart of the training area, the live firing impact zone, and the church behind me is the former parish church of the village of Stanford. And as you can see, it's a round towered church, the only one inside the training area. The tower is 12th century with a belfry on top that was probably put there in the 15th century. The rest of the church, which has aisles but no clerestory, seems to have been largely rebuilt at the expense of the rector, Frederick Sutton, in the 19th century, and he seems to have treated it as something of a hobby. Frederick Sutton not only paid for the work, he designed a lot of it and even made it himself, including the stenciling and the stained glass. But as you can see, there's not a lot of it left today. The piles of tiles that you can see were taken off the roof when it was replaced by blast-proof panels. And a church that's been out of use for 80 years is bound not to have a lot going for it. And I must say that since I last visited this church 20 years ago, it has seriously deteriorated. The smallest village in the training area was Sturston. It had a population of just 48 at the middle of the 19th century. There had been a church dedicated to Holy Cross, but it had been lost many centuries before that. All that remains is this intriguing building behind me. And so we come to the last of the churches on our journey through the training area. This is Tottington. Tottington was the largest of the villages, and it had a population of more than 500 in the 19th century. Its church is by far the biggest, and it's magnificent, very much church of the 14th century, with the flowing curvilinear tracery of that time that we also find a mile or so off at Thompson. People who visited Tottington Church before the Second World War spoke very highly of the white light coming in through the clear windows, falling on 15th century furnishings, the bench ends of animals and mythical creatures. But it's 80 years since this church was last used for worship. The tiles here were taken off the roof and it was replaced with blast-proof panels. Some of the old furnishings are still lying here in the aisle, and intriguingly, some of the 15th century bench ends are still here too, though many have gone to St Peter Hungate in the middle of Norwich. 80 years is a long time. It's a lifetime. And there's no way that the churches of the battle training area can ever be returned to use. Yet still they stand as touchstones to the long generations of their parishioners, and many of whom lie in the churchyard outside. In 1942, preparations for the D-Day landings and the land war in Europe were already underway, and it became clear that a large area was needed for battlefield training. This part of Norfolk was chosen. 6 villages were cleared, more than 1,000 people who were promised that they would be allowed back at the end of the war. This never happened, and it's caused a certain amount of resentment to resound down the years. The area remains in use for its original purpose. Today, they're training Ukrainians for the war against Russia. The wind ripples the Breckland grasses. The deer, the sheep, and the rabbits lead their uncomplicated lives. The incursions of armour are slight and temporary in this great vastness. The pattern of the past survives here in a way that is lost elsewhere, in an England which has been redeveloped and rebuilt by generation after generation. Here, emptied of people now, untouched by the complications of civilization, the past lingers on. And there is also the memory of the past, the ghosts and dreams of the old times, the lives once led, now but names on the stones in the churchyards. Let this stand. For in those days, the churches were always out in the fields, and they remain there. The high hedge lanes still weave nearby, and the silence of that earlier age still engulfs them. Let them remain so.